Okay. So, hi everyone. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest, Mr. Regelman. Mr. Regelman is Senior Executive Vice President and CEO of Security Services and Digital at BNY Mellon. As CEO of Security Services, he focuses on product strategy and development to accelerate the transformation of security services into a more data-led business. As head of digital, he sets the direction for BNY Mellon's digital future and drives investments in the firm's data capabilities. Now, it's my honor to welcome our guest, Mr. Regelman, and the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you, Zunian. Thanks, everyone. Great to talk to all of you. First of all, maybe I want to explain to all of you what Bank of New York Mellon is. Many people think about a bank. This is the bank where you have your checking account. You go to Weston Center. There are a couple of them. We are not that kind of bank. If you think about all stock market, so this is the New York Stock Exchange that people mostly invest in, but also all the stock markets in the world. The value of all stock markets is $100 trillion. So this is trillion, right? So this is 1 trillion is 1,000 billion. So 100 trillion is the value of all stocks. Roughly the value of all bonds are also 100 trillion. So that makes investable assets around 200 trillion in the world. I'm not talking about real assets like real estate, roads. That's separate because you cannot really invest into them directly. You can invest through different instruments. So what we do custody and accounting for these assets. Not for all of them because we obviously have competition, but roughly for 20%. So if you think about all the assets in the world, we do custody and accounting for 20% of that. Now, what's custody and accounting? If you have your checking account, your bank holds this money. In the old days, they would store the money in a vault. In the modern days, they obviously store that in a digital form, maybe with Federal Reserve or somewhere else. But all the investors that invest into these assets, and there are a lot of investment firms, specifically in the Boston area, think of Fidelity. Somebody needs to make sure that assets are protected and assets are accounted for. So at the end of the day, if you want to know how much you got, somebody needs to do that. So that's what Bank of New York Mellon does in assets. So and when I say assets, this is maybe your small investment account. This is your parents' retirement account. This is 529 to those that have it, to support you going to college. So all of these things that we call assets, and some firm like Fidelity or Vanguard usually manages that. And that what we do the back office, back end of these things. So we really ensure that assets are there. So if somebody tells you you have $100, then you have $100. And if it changes because the market moves up, market moves down, as it's been happening lately, you know exactly what you have. And if you need to get it back, you can get that back. So custody is in essence safekeeping. Again, in the very olden days, custody was done in a vault, physical vault, in the basement of our building. The address was 1 Wall Street. Bank of New York was started by Alexander Hamilton. So we are almost 240 years old. Actually was the first bank in this country, was the first publicly traded company. And when Alexander Hamilton started that, there was no central money. I mean, that way seems strange to us. How come you would not have central money? But American government, at that time, being very new, asked private banks to issue money. So one of the things that we did, when I say we, this is 240 years old, 240 years ago, we issued money. So the first cent that US government issued was issued at Bank of New York. So those days you kept your money in a vault. We actually probably have maybe a couple hundred of these coins still in the vault. Obviously they are worth a lot more than a cent, even though nominally they're worth a cent. Now, fast forward to 140 years from now, you obviously keep that into digital form. So that's what we do. Now, there is a topic of digital assets because, Zunian, when you introduced me, you described 2 roles. You described the security services role, which is basically what I was talking about now, custody, accounting of these all assets. Now, what's digital? Digital are 2 things. One is to digitizing the way we do things. Again, if you think in olden days, people would come to the bank. They say, I need $500. You would give them your card, they would ask for the ID, and they would give you $500 cash. Probably none of you ever experienced that, but your parents certainly have. In a more modern world, you actually use ATM. But you probably don't even use ATM anymore because you can use Venmo, you can send money in electronic ways. So that's digitization of what we do. But also there are digital assets. I'm sure you all heard of Bitcoin. There are other assets in addition to Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is the one that gets all the attention. You also probably heard of NFTs. So this is non-fungible tokens. And for those that haven't, you can watch very funny skit that Saturday Night Live did on what is NFT. I mean, that was the skit was obviously a joke, but there is some seriousness to that. So in essence, what digital assets are a digital representation of some normal assets. So if somebody has a stock, that's a physical certificate, you can represent that in a digital form. And you can store, instead of storing something physically, you can store what's called key. So there's a public key and a private key. So you store the private key to this asset. And that's, again, custody back to what I was explaining. Now, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is an asset that's backed by algorithms. So if you ask what is a US dollar is backed by US government. So if you want to say, hey, how do I know the dollar is good? US government tells you that the dollar is good. If you want to ask how UK pound is good, that's backed by the UK. And that's why in some countries in the world, the currency may not be so stable because that government doesn't back them well. So Bitcoin, unlike the government backing, it actually has a backing of the algorithms. So just a different form, and some people who believe in kind of libertarian leanings say, why do I need to have a government back the coin if I trust computers more? And that's where the digital world and let's call it traditional world really connect or collide, depending on your point of view. If you want to say they connect because somebody needs to transform digital assets into normal assets, or if you want to believe it's collides, then you could say the digital world will supplant the normal world, which in my view will not happen, because are you going to suggest your grandmother to put money and trust the network? Probably not. Maybe it will happen more when you are that grandmother and you need to actually think about retirement savings, but I don't think any of your grandmothers, and I use the word grandmother proverbially, would want to put their retirement into digital assets alone. So that's a little bit about me. So think of a very large bank, very old bank, 240 years old, but it's not bank for people. It's a bank for asset managers that really helps financial systems to work. And we have 20% of all the assets in the world in our custody. So we don't own them, we custody them, which means we keep them.
Thank you so much, Mr. Regelman. Now I'm going to open up the conversation to anyone who has any questions.
Yeah, I have a question. Would you say the majority of the assets are, wait, sorry, 1 second. Sammy, can you turn your volume off? Yeah. Thank you. Are they managed digitally now or still by workforce of humans? And are you trying to make it more digital based?
So the assets, majority of them are managed by people, but people use computers. If a typical investment manager has a fund and they make decisions to sell and buy. Now, long time ago, they would make these decisions based on a gut feel. If I own McDonald's, I would go to McDonald's store, see how it feels, are they processing clients well, is there a big queue forming, and I would make a decision to buy or sell a stock based on that. Obviously, the world is a lot more sophisticated than that. So I don't need to do mystery shopping. I can get signals from many different stores. I can look at their supply chain. I can see if the sales rising or declining. I can look at difference in currencies they get, and I would make my stock picking decision based on that. But that's done with the help of computers. So now we're talking about managing regular stocks using people, and people are supported by computers. Now, when you manage digital assets, like you decide to buy or sell Bitcoin, the process is exactly the same. It just there is less information to be gained that people are needed for, so computers take a greater role in that.
Thank you. So I have a question. What is a use case for Bitcoin that existing currencies do not yet fulfill?
So there are two type of use cases that people think about. One, it's 7 by 24 and it's global. Because if you have a US dollar in your pocket and you want to give that to somebody else in another country at night, it's very hard to do that. The bank is closed. So if you have an account, even if you have an account, let's say in Citizens Bank in Weston, the branch may be closed. You can go online, but it's still a dollar, so you need to pay to convert to another currency. And this process takes a long time and may cost you a lot. Sometimes people call it a friction cost. In other ways to say transaction cost. So the idea with Bitcoin, you can do it 7 by 24, and you can do it real time. The problem is that today on Bitcoin, the transaction costs are also high. So yes, you can do it, but actually going to cost you a lot. That's what I would call a legitimate case. The less legitimate case, it's anonymous. US government, can trace dollars. You have responsibility to disclose any transactions for more than $10,000 versus in Bitcoin, it's less known. So some early adopters of Bitcoin had what I would call, criminal or maybe semi-criminal cases. And when I say semi-criminal, I don't mean like a trafficking or arms, just maybe they did not want to declare taxes. Now, there are technologies now. In fact, there is a company called Chainalysis that Bank of New York invested in that allow you to trace all the transactions of Bitcoin from the beginning. The last thing I would add, Zunian, that as other digital assets become available, they may make the legitimacy, which is the first part of this thing, work better, and yet not allow for some more illicit trades. And that's why sometimes people talk about central bank issued digital coins. So don't think about Bitcoin, think about digital dollar. So it works like a normal dollar, except you can transact with that digitally. And that would be really cool because you get the benefit of both.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And definitely that's been happening very recently is the Chinese yuan going digital. There's considerations of the US making a digital coin as well. So that's definitely very relevant. I think Joseph has a question.
So how do you see the friction between private cryptocurrencies and obviously a digital US dollar that the government is working on planning? How do you see the clash between private and government equity coming out?
Did you guys hear it well?
Yeah, I think there was just some echo. Do you mind repeating your question?
So obviously,
Joseph, maybe grab the phone if you can.
Do you want me to come over to your computer, Zunian?
No, I think you're good now.
Then you're good now.
Okay, thank you. So obviously the government is looking at a digital US dollar, and there are also private cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum. How do you see the clash between those two cryptocurrencies, the type of government versus private playing out?
So I personally think it'll be very hard for government to allow private companies to issue currency. Look at the current situation in the world. As US wants to impose sanctions on Russia, the way they do that, they control the flow of US dollars. Basically, there is a global system called SWIFT, which allows all the banks to connect. And US can say, I'm going to disconnect you from SWIFT. And US has this power because the dollar is dominant currency, and US obviously is a dominant economy. And Europeans can do the same thing. But if it's issued by a private company, especially if this private company is not in the US, is not in the European Union, you don't have this kind of control. That's why the government very much regulates money and control of money. You don't even need to go far. Think about a gift certificate in a local mall. Somebody gives you a $100 gift certificate. It's good for $100. Yeah, sure. The risk is pretty small that Nike will go out of business. But again, would you put all your retirement money into that? That is not backed by the country? You probably won't. So that's why I think the private currencies will have some use, but I don't think they can ever become dominant, because that's one of the key functions of the government, any government, especially US government, is to control supply and demand of money.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, I have a question. So with China having already launched its electronic yuan, do you think something along a Fed line or a Fed coin equivalent in the US is bound to happen? And what do you see as the effects of such an implementation?
So I think the answer is yes, and I really mean I think, I don't know that. If you think of kind of geopolitical balance, one of the strengths of the US is dominance of dollar. Using dollar around the world is easy. Many countries accept dollar. You trade globally using dollar. In fact, when euro was created, many people felt that euro may challenge dollar. It did, but slightly. Certainly, China is very interested in yuan challenging dollar as well. Now, how do you challenge that? One of the ways is to make it easier. If it costs me 5 cents to send a dollar from here to, let's say, Singapore, and it only costs me 1 cent to send yuan, then I may consider that. And digital yuan actually would kind of help potentially with that. If that becomes something that gains market share, then US will have to respond. Now, US has other things. Obviously, it's a disposal because it controls a lot of international trade. But I do think it's bound to happen eventually.
Thank you. And then also, how has Bitcoin evolved over the past decade, and how do you see its role in society evolving over the next decade?
I think when Bitcoin was created, it was a little bit of a technology project. It was a technology project done by geeks and done by libertarians that sort of believe, will challenge, the government. And lots of people did not pay attention to that. It started gaining popularity. First, what I would describe is global trade, what was not properly sanctioned. One of the early adopters of Bitcoin were people that needed to trade internationally and did not want to be seen. Some cases, there were proper companies that just did not want to pay to the banks. In some cases, were less proper use cases, people paying for illicit goods. Then it's entered mainstream, and a lot of people started investing into Bitcoin. When we talk about investing, there are two types of investors. There are retail investors, so that's all of you, your parents, your friends, and then that's what I call institutional investors. So this is the people that Bank of New York works with. So this is Fidelity. So one that became valuable, then you saw people like Fidelity actually starting to invest in the Bitcoin, which obviously added popularity. And you saw the run up of the price of Bitcoin. It went up to as much as maybe $65,000, $70,000. It entered mainstream. You look at CNBC, in addition to the stock market index, in addition to currencies, you start seeing the price of Bitcoin. But that said, people start questioning, okay, that's so big, but is it real? And that debate been ranging for a long time. I think your question was, what are the uses of Bitcoin? if the users of Bitcoin are not that numerous, then why would you use Bitcoin? People equate Bitcoin to digital gold because the price of gold is not justified if you look at gold as a metal. If you forget the fact that people want to use it for jewelry, if you forget that gold is cool, if you just think, wow, I can use gold in manufacturing a car, then the price of gold would be really a fraction of a cent. But obviously people think gold is cool, and that's why gold became universal currency. So that's sort of, there was a way of doing a Bitcoin. But going back to your previous question, the government obviously wasn't very comfortable with that. And they start putting some mechanisms to restrict trade of Bitcoin to more traditional banks. And that puts some pressure on the price of Bitcoin. So I think time will tell whether Bitcoin will rise or decline. But the fact that digital assets, which is something much easier to transact with, which you can do 24/7, the fact that that will become more mainstream, I think that's undeniable.
I had one more question. Does your company work more with other companies when they want to manage finance with New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ 500? Who do they interact more with?
So we work with all the exchanges, including NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange. But our clients are investment management firms typically. So if you take the S&P 500 index, which is probably one of the most famous index, so Dow Jones 30 index, investment manager, let's say Fidelity or Vanguard, would have a fund, and then we would do the custody of these stocks. And these stocks would be traded on New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or London Stock Exchange. So it could be any exchange in the world. And now we have, in some parts of the world, digital-only exchanges that actually doesn't have a physical building. Like New York Stock Exchange, you can actually visit. I was there last month when our CEO retired. It's also 200 years old, but in some parts of the world, the stock exchange doesn't have a physical address.
Thank you. Fred has a question actually. He asks, what do the big banks and mainstream institutions think of Bitcoin?
So the big banks think that Bitcoin entered mainstream. And if it's something as a mainstream asset, then obviously the big banks need to be involved in that. So for example, as I described, we do custody of all sorts of stocks. We may do custody of Microsoft. The price of Microsoft may increase or decrease, but we still do the safekeeping of that. So similarly, we would do safekeeping of Bitcoin, whether it increases or decreases. Bottom line, it became mainstream. Is that going to be bigger or smaller? I don't know. But if it's something as a mainstream, then we need to provide service in support of all sorts of investors.
Thank you. I think just one more question. Does anyone else have a question? Okay. So what is one thing about cryptocurrencies that you see but you don't think others are seeing?
I think we saw early on that it's going to enter mainstream, and it's entering. People thought that's more for enthusiasts, for geeks, for people that are trying to avoid banking system, and now it's firmly in the mainstream. And we saw that earlier than others, and I really feel that's our competitive advantage.
Thank you. Well, I think that brings us to a close in terms of time. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Regelman, and sharing your perspective on cryptocurrencies. Thank you so much,
Great,
and
guys.
thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.